Okay, good morning everybody, and welcome to our webinar on phase four free allocations. We've just done a quick poll, and it's interesting to see that around about 50% of people are about 50% aware of phase four allocation, and we hope that over the next hour that that will improve as we go through the slides. So my name is Simon Watson. I'll be familiar to a lot of you because I've been working in the market for quite a long time now, and I'm going to be a moderator for this morning's webinar. So this is a technical webinar, and it's really intended for installations with staff who are familiar to the process of the phase four free allocation. Now, as you can see on our slide, I'll be joined by Lewis Redshaw, who has been involved in the carbon markets since 2005, heading up the environmental markets at Barclays Capital. Also joining us this morning will be Tom Lord, who has over 10 years experience in the markets and also comes from Barclays. So just as a little introduction, what we're looking at this morning is the phase four, which commences on the 1st of January, which is just over 3 months away now, and that will run for a 10-year period until 2030. So the EU ETS, European Union Emissions Trading Scheme, is a mandatory scheme for all full member states of the EU, and it covers over 11,000 installations. However, the biggest question remains, and will remain after our presentation, after our seminar, that the Green Deal is going to change a lot. Green Deal has big ambitions. It potentially is going to widen the scope of the EU ETS by bringing transport in. And then also there'll be the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is planned to come in 2023. So all these will bring more issues to the scheme. And of course, another big thing is Brexit. UK installations will not be part of phase four of the EU ETS because the UK leaves the EU on the 31st of December. However, the UK is planning to put a scheme in, a trading scheme, and in theory, it hoped to be linked to the EU ETS. But whatever happens, the UK will follow the same rules as being put in by the by this for free allocation. So if it's a carbon tax, the free allocation will still apply, and if it's a UK scheme, it will still apply the same. So just looking at this morning's agenda, Lewis is going to go through a background and an introduction to how free carbon allocation came about. And then Tom will look at phase four and how the potential free allocation is going to be for your installations. Now, as ever, there's a lot of jargon in this market. You know, the energy markets is full of jargon. Carbon is not an exception to that. And you can see we have a lot of abbreviations in here, but they'll become clearer as we go further through the presentation. So, because we're restricted on time and this is going to be quick, we'll move on. There's a lot to get through. If anybody has any questions, please use the box on the presentation to type your questions, and then at the end we'll come back to them and try and answer them as best we can. If we can't answer your questions, we'll get back to you direct. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Lewis, who will begin with a background to the free allocation process.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for that handover, Simon. And I'm going to go through the basics of free allocation as things stand at the moment. And these rules have been set since at least 2013. And in theory, it's a very straightforward process, but just giving you a little bit more background. The reason there is a free allocation is to allow for a smooth transition to reducing emissions. So what that means is rather than forcing everybody to buy all of their carbon emissions, by giving a number of them away for free, it reduces the shock to the system. Now, in phase one and phase two, the vast majority of allowances were given away for free to installations. And that was based on a grandfathering rule whereby historic emissions were very relevant to that free allocation formula. Now in phase 3, things got tightened up quite a lot, and the power sector, for example, stopped receiving free allocation, and in fact they were such a large component of the system that auctioning became the main method of distributing EU allowances, and free allocation was retained by industry and some parts of the power sector. So in order to make free allocation fair, a common EU-wide industry-specific approach was taken, and it was called benchmarking. And we're going to talk about that in a moment in a little bit more detail. Previous slide, please, Simon. And we get to know what free allocation is for installations using what at first sight seems a very simple formula. So that formula is free allocation equals your historic activity level, otherwise known as HAL, times multiplied by the benchmark factor, multiplied by the carbon leakage exposure factor, and then multiplied by the cross-sectoral correction factor, and in some cases the linear reduction factor. And they sound, so it's a simple calculation, of course, they sound complex, and we'll explain all of those in the next few slides. So just benchmarking briefly. So benchmarks are calculations of the amount of CO2 produced per unit of production. And now those benchmarks are calculated by approaching all of the installations, as a lot of you will know, you've been through this process recently, to find out what your production levels are and your emissions performance for those production levels. Now each benchmark is set for each industry sector. And so, for example, we've got here iron casting and primary and secondary aluminium production. And the benchmarks are set for the whole industry at the level of the average of the 10% of the best performing installations within that given sector. So we've got an example for you here, which is the aluminium sector in the graph here. And you can see the emissions. There's 30 installations assessed in this particular example. And we can see the emissions per ton of aluminium produced. And we can see that the benchmark's been set at the average of the top 10%, so basically the top 3 of those 30 installations. And the objective of benchmarking is to reward the most efficient installations and to ultimately to penalize the least efficient with a view to getting them to improve their efficiency. So if you fall below the line, and you'll see that installation number 1 falls below the line, you'll actually get a free allocation that is larger than your requirement based on the benchmark part at least. And if you fall above the line, you will get a free allocation that is equal to the benchmark value, and that will mean that you've got a gap between what your real emissions are and what you're given for free. So the other 2 important factors, well, there's 4 important factors, but the next 2 important factors are the historic activity level and the carbon leakage exposure factor. Now, starting with the HAL, that's just based on historical production, and installations submit their HAL data that's verified by your auditor, and that's used to calculate free allocation. Now, phase 3, the historic activity level, was allowed to be either your activity in the period 2005 to 2008 or your activity in the period 2009-2010. Now, of course, every single industry will have cherry-picked the best production levels, the highest production levels for that calculation based on the period that they were able to choose. Now, that meant that if, for example, you're using the older data because your emissions were higher, you're going to get a larger free allocation during phase 3 than they might need. And such an approach was, again, really designed to minimize the friction of adopting this new approach to free allocation. Moving on to the carbon leakage exposure factor, otherwise known as CLEF. Well, most of you will know that carbon leakage occurs when Europe imports products from jurisdictions where there are no restrictions on CO2 emissions. And those products are cheaper as a consequence, and they cause industry in Europe to reduce its emissions by reducing production. And that's not what the objective of the emissions trading scheme is. So the carbon leakage list was put together to protect companies that were at risk of carbon leakage or actually excess competition from imports, or indeed those companies facing difficulty exporting their products into countries where there were no carbon restrictions. Now, back in phase 3, there are 179 sectors included on the carbon leakage list. In fact, it's quite difficult to find sectors that weren't included on the leakage list. There are relatively few examples of installations that didn't have this very high level of protection. And if you're on the carbon leakage list, then you will get a carbon leakage exposure factor of 1. And that means that whatever your benchmark calculation was, when multiplied by the historic activity level, you will get 100% of that value, subject to the last piece that I'll explain in a moment. And the objective, of course, is to level the playing field with international industry. If you didn't make it onto the carbon leakage list, then you would get a much lower free allocation. But again, in order to smooth the transition to the new way of making free allocations, the Commission allowed 80%, so allowed the CLEF to be 0.8 for those installations in the first year, and that dropped to 0.3 by the end of the phase, which is this year, 2020. Now, of course, that meant that those companies that didn't make the leakage list were getting a much smaller free allocation. But again, it was quite generous in the early years. Now, all of those factors. So if you're beating the benchmark and you've reported your historic activity level, and you get the carbon leakage list, you'll get a the most efficient will deem a generous free allocation. The least efficient will always be a little bit short, but you will get a quantity of allowances that reflects your emissions. But along comes the cross-sectoral correction factor to upset that calculation and upset industry across Europe. The cross-sectoral correction factor is designed to allow the pot of allowances to be divided up fairly amongst industry. And so it's only used if all the calculations on historic activity levels, when factoring in benchmarks and then factoring in again the carbon leakage, if the total amount of free allocation that's going to go to industry is larger than the pot of EU allowances that the European Commission has designated for industry, then and I mean every single free allocation, even those on the carbon leakage list, every single free allocation is cut arbitrarily in order to meet the cap that's set by the European Commission for all of industry. And the way the European Commission sets that cap is subject to lots of debate, but the Commission divides the amount of EU allowances into what can be auctioned, what can be given away for free, and what will go into the new entrant reserve and other pots of allowances that are used for various funds. Now, in phase 3, that cross-sectoral correction factor resulted in a cut of around 1.7% per year, and that was cumulative. So if you look at the table below, you can see that the cross-sectoral correction factor started at a nearly 6% drop from what everyone was expecting, and by the time we get to 2020, on the far right-hand side, there's something like an 18% reduction in free allocation. So what we're saying is, even the most efficient installations that were on the carbon leakage list could end up facing a shortfall in 2020 because of the cross-sectoral correction factor. And as a consequence, of course, it makes it deeply unpopular. Just briefly on the linear reduction factor, and that's applied to electricity generators and new entrants. And that started at a factor of 1 in 2013 and dropped by 1.74% per year all the way through to 2020. So those installations that were affected by the linear reduction factor would see around a 12% reduction in their free allocation by 2020. But the cross-sectoral correction factor is by far the most significant, both in terms of scope, who it applies to, and in terms of the cut that it makes to that free allocation. Now that's my slides done, and as you'll have seen, the calculation is a very simple one, but we start to get into some of the rules and regulations around the factors that go into that calculation, and things can fast get quite complicated. But I'm handing over now to Tom Lord, who will explain how all that's going to change in phase 4, and we can give you some examples at the end of all of this to show you where free allocation has been in phase 3 and where it could go for each installation in phase 4. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Lewis, and thank you, Simon, for the introduction as well. So as Lewis said, I'm going to take us through the changes to the free allocation process in phase 4. So in terms of the main headlines for phase 4, we have a linear reduction factor that will increase to 2.2% per annum. So as Lewis has already mentioned, the linear reduction factor governs the speed at which the emissions cap falls. So that will actually increase to 2.2% per annum. Phase 4, being the longest of the phases we've seen in the EU ETS so far, will actually be split into 2 free allocation periods. So the first period will be the first half of phase 4, 2021 to 2025, and the second half will be the second period of 2026 to 2030. And that will allow them to revise the benchmarks and other data halfway through the phase to ensure that the free allocation remains accurate and using the most up-to-date data possible. In total through phase 4, there will be around 6 billion allowances allocated for free. So it will be a substantial amount of allowances given away. Perhaps most crucially, the free allocation formula used to calculate everyone's free allocation is actually unchanged. So it relies on exactly the same formula. It's just the data within that will be updated. So in terms of the benchmarks, as Lewis mentioned, the benchmarks are a measure of emissions intensity per sector. And those benchmarks will be changing. So there will be an annual reduction applied to benchmarks between 0.2% and 1.6% as a maximum. That change in benchmark will be based on new data the Commission have collected. And it will actually be backdated as well. So the annual emissions or the annual benchmark reduction rate will be applied from 2008 to the middle of the free allocation period it applies to. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, there's 2 free allocation periods in phase 4, the first half and then the second half. So the reduction rate will actually be applied to the middle of the first half of the phase and then to the middle of the second half of the phase for the second free allocation period. Whilst those benchmarks aren't actually finalised yet, the initial guidance suggests that most industries will fall at the upper end of the reduction rate. So most industries are likely to be nearer the 1.6% annual reduction than the 0.2% annual reduction. The table at the bottom of this slide gives a little worked example of how those annual reduction rates are applied, and also the total percentage change that you can expect depending on where you fall within that range. So at the 0.2%, so the lower end of the annual reduction rate. In the first half of phase 4, your free allocation will have fallen, or your benchmark rate will have fallen by 3%. In the second half of phase 4, it would be 4%. There's quite a big jump to the upper end of the scale, with 1.6% applied per year and backdated. In the first half of phase 4, that would translate into a benchmark reduction of 24%, and in the second half of phase 4, it would be 32%. And as I say, the initial guidance suggests that most sectors will find themselves towards the upper end of that scale, so the 24 to 32% change across the course of phase 4. So in addition to the benchmark changes, there will also be updates to the carbon leakage list and the historical activity level. So the historical activity level will be updated to just reflect more recent data. So it will look at production data from the years 2014 to 2018 inclusive for the first half of phase 4. So a 5-year period, and then in the second half of phase 4, it will look at production data from 2019 through to 2023 inclusive, and it will take an average of those 5 years to use for your historical activity level for your free allocation calculations. Now, they're obviously updating the historical activity level to ensure that those have had significant changes in production from the original historical activity level years, that is reflected, and they're receiving a more accurate free allocation. The carbon leakage list has also been updated already, and that has already been finalised. So there are 63 sectors retained on the carbon leakage list, and 116 sectors have been removed. So it is a significant reduction to the carbon leakage list. However, it's probably important to note that the biggest emitting sectors, such as steel and cement, do remain protected. So a lot of the sectors that have fallen off the carbon leakage list are at the much smaller end of the emissions scale. But for those that fall off the list, it is a pretty drastic change in free allocation, and we will look at some worked examples a little bit later. Sectors that have fallen off the list will get a maximum of 30% of their benchmarked free allocation until 2026. So for the first half of phase 4, you'll get a maximum of 30% of that benchmark free allocation. In the second half of phase 4, that changes further. So it will decrease in a linear rate down to 0 by 2030. So those that have fallen off the carbon leakage list by the end of phase 4 will be getting no free allocation. The exception to this is district heating, which will remain at 30% through the whole of phase 4. But as you can tell, it's a pretty sizable decrease in free allocation for anyone who's dropping off that carbon leakage list. Electricity generators will continue to get no free allocation. As with phase 4, there are some derogation exceptions to that. So some member states will be allowed to give free allocation to their electricity generators with the purpose of helping the electricity sector to modernise. So it may seem like it's all bad news, but it's not. There is some good news. The purpose of the changes being made to the free allocation and the updates is to ensure that those in most need are given the free allocation they require. So there are several reasons for this. Firstly, in terms of avoiding windfall profits. So the danger with free allocation and the use of free allocation is that it goes to those that don't actually need it, or people get too much free allocation compared to their actual emissions requirements. So what they're aiming to do is actually ensure that that those that need the free allocation are getting it. To aid that, there is also an auction flexibility mechanism brought in. So Lewis mentioned earlier that allowances are distributed either by way of free allocation or by way of auctioning. So if you think of 2 pots of allowances, one for free allocation, one for auctioning, what will happen in phase 4 And the purpose of this is to avoid the cross-sectoral correction factor. So the factor that Lewis mentioned earlier, when there's not enough free allocation to go round, to avoid the application of the cross-sectoral correction factor, there will be an auction flexibility mechanism. So it will allow some allowances from the auction pot to be transferred into the free allocation pot to ensure that industry are getting their calculated free allocation. There was a tiered carbon leakage exposure proposal put forward when they were looking at the phase 4 rules. That was actually rejected. So the carbon leakage list will remain as a binary selection. So you are either on the carbon leakage list and deemed exposed to carbon leakage, or you are off the list and deemed not exposed. Arguably, there are even within sectors. Arguably, there are some installations that were more exposed to carbon leakage, but I believe for simplicity's sake, the binary selection will continue. We do expect that in the first half of phase 4, at least, that the cross-sectoral correction factor will not need to be applied. So there will be no haircuts to free allocation, we believe, in the first half of phase 4. So the number of allowances in the free allocation pot will be sufficient to give the calculated free allocations to all those installations who are receiving free allocation. It's very difficult to say the second half of phase 4 whether that will be the case, and we will we'll explain a little bit more on why in a slide or two's time. In addition to the free allocation, there will also be 2 funds to aid the green transition. So firstly, there'll be the Innovation Fund, and the Innovation Fund will be seeded by the sale of allowances in auctions, and that is actually happening now. So the Innovation Fund is a fund that industry can utilize to help them change processes and move towards greener technology. I believe the first window for applications towards the Innovation Fund closes at the end of October, I think it is. So that fund will exist to allow installations across Europe to aid that transition. And there is also the Modernisation Fund, which will be used for the electricity sector to aid that green transition there. Another of the big changes, and this loops in with the first point in terms of ensuring free allocation is given to those most in need. We are moving to a dynamic free allocation system. So the dynamic free allocation system ensures that when there is a production change of plus or minus 15%, that an installation can apply for more free allocation in the case of a production increase, or may lose free allocation in the case of a production decrease. Now that rolling dynamic free allocation is based on a rolling 2-year average. So each year, installations will be required to submit production data to the Commission, and those calculations will be done to ensure that on a rolling 2-year average, there isn't a plus or minus 15% change to production. If there is, then free allocation may be changed for the year coming. So that will ensure or help to ensure that free allocation is given to those most in need. So those that are experiencing significant capacity changes or increases in production will be able to get more free allocation. It's quite a big change from phase 3, when the rules were a 50% change, which essentially ruled out almost everyone from applying for more free allocation in the case of production changes. So there are still some unknowns in terms of phase 4 free allocation. So the benchmark values are still to be confirmed for the first half of phase 4. We do expect that to be confirmed towards the end of this year, perhaps rolling into Q1 2021. Obviously, that's not ideal, because we are essentially on the verge of phase 4 now, and it's very difficult to know exactly what free allocation sectors will get. We do have a pretty good idea, and based on initial data, we can forecast fairly accurately what free allocation will be. But that benchmark data is still to be confirmed. As I mentioned earlier, we do expect that the cross-sectoral correction factor will not need to be applied in the first half of phase 4, so there won't be any arbitrary reductions. But again, not confirmed, so we cannot confirm that right now, but we do think that it won't need to be applied. In addition, the aviation sector, the proportion of free allocation is also still not decided. So the aviation sector is subject to slightly different free allocation rules, but they are actually looking at changing the proportion of auctioning and free allocation in the aviation sector, and those rules are still not decided. So again, not ideal in terms of risk management and planning for future carbon costs. Perhaps the biggest change still to come is around the Green Deal, and the Green Deal is a topic we could have a webinar all by itself on. But in short, it is looking to dramatically alter the ambition of Europe's climate change reduction targets, and that will have a big impact on the EU ETS free allocation rules. So the linear reduction factor that we mentioned earlier, that increases to 2.2%. Under the Green Deal, we could see that climbing to over 5% per annum, and that is a huge change. When you think the change from phase 3, where it was 1.74%, to phase 4 to 2.2% is a relatively small change. That climbing to over 5% per annum in the second half of phase 4 is a huge step shift change. Also, one of the things that the Commission are looking at are carbon border adjustments carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and they're looking to have these in place by 2023. So there is a lot of work being done by the Commission and wider groups at the moment, looking at the impact of CBAMs, as they're called, and how they might be applied and to which sectors they may be applied. But the biggest impact on free allocation is likely to be those sectors covered by a carbon border adjustment mechanism would receive no free allocation. So the carbon border adjustment mechanism could be applied in several ways, but effectively what it will do is make imports pay some form of carbon price. There's several ways that can be done, but if that is applied, then the risk of carbon leakage is removed, or the argument is that the risk of carbon leakage is removed, and therefore those sectors will receive zero free allocation. The carbon border adjustment mechanism is a very complicated piece of work that is being undertaken. So, as I say, at the moment it's in the initial stages. It's very difficult to say how that will play out. But the main takeaway is that those sectors covered are likely to then lose all their free allocation and will be required to buy every single allowance they require from there forward. And the other change is the cross-sectoral correction factor. So, with Europe greatly increasing its emissions reduction targets, there's going to be less allowances to go round, so both in the auction pot and the free allocation pot, and that increases the chances that the cross-sectoral correction factor is applied in the second half of phase 4. Again, it's quite difficult to make any kind of reliable forecast, because there is a lot still to be decided and worked out under the Green Deal. But what Europe have been very clear on is that they are aiming to become the global leader in the fight against climate change, and with that comes obviously a step change in emissions reduction targets. Crucially, the EU have also been very clear that that will not be at the expense of European industry, but there are big changes coming to the way that installations will have to interact with the EU ETS, and also the free allocation they can expect to receive. So, whilst there are still a number of unknowns, it is possible to model phase 4 free allocation levels. So what we've done here is pull out some example forecasts from actual customer data, and these come in 3 main scenarios. So firstly, a company that is never on the leakage list. Secondly, one that stays on the leakage list. And thirdly, one that falls off the leakage list. And as I say, it's impossible to do this with 100% accuracy, but we can therefore model scenarios and ensure that we give companies a good idea of what free allocation they can expect through phase 4. It is important to note that obviously these scenarios are specific to installation. So this is an overview of one specific installation, but as I say, everyone's free allocation will look slightly differently because of all the different parts of the free allocation formula. So when we look at this this graph, the top yellow line is annual emissions. The dashed orange line is a COVID scenario that we build in for our customers in their free allocation scenarios. But in terms of the free allocation, the most important bit is the red line and then the scenarios thereafter. So the red line going into 2020 is free allocation as we know it for phase 3. So this is already known. And that is modelled in this chart. From 2020, that's where the kind of forecast scenarios come in, and you'll see that there's 3 lines there that actually branch into 4 lines in the second half of phase 4. So from 2021, we have the middle red line, which is the base case scenario. So this is a middle benchmark reduction. So in the 0.2% per annum up to 1.6 per annum, it's a middle scenario within that range. The blue line is the 0.2% benchmark reductions per annum, and the grey line is the 1.6. So that gives us a pretty good idea of what's happening to free allocation. You'll see that this company was never on the leakage list, so they had quite an aggressive reduction in free allocation through phase 3. There is a small uptick in free allocation at the start of phase 4, just due to production level changes. That free allocation flatlines through the first half of phase 4 and then starts to drop away through the second half of phase 4. The black line that we build in at the back end, so the second half of phase 4 at the bottom, so the worst case scenario, that's actually building in a steeper LRF due to the Green Deal. So that's giving this company an idea of what they might be able to expect come the back end of phase 4. So if we look at another worked example, this is a company that stays on the leakage list, and it's exactly the same line. So I won't go over what each line is representing again, but you can see there's once again on the benchmark case, the red line, there is a small uptick in free allocation for the first half of phase 4. This company on the leakage list receives a protected free allocation, so they have a much more generous free allocation compared to emissions, but they do still have a shortfall in all scenarios. So these 3 lines, the blue, the red, and the grey, again give you the scenarios based on that benchmark reduction rate. The black line again builds in this worst case scenario based on this higher LRF. And then perhaps the most dramatic of the 3 scenarios is a company that falls off the leakage list. So here we have quite a generous free allocation in phase 3 because they were protected by the carbon leakage list. They were actually receiving more free allocation than they required for their annual compliance requirements. Come 2021, there's a huge change in that free allocation due to the fact they lose carbon leakage list protection. So there's a great big drop down to a much lower level of free allocation, and then as you can see towards the end of phase 4, they're actually declining to a 0 free allocation. So this is a huge change for a company that we're receiving in 2020 will have received around 18,000 tons in free allocation, all the way down to 0 in 2030, and obviously that comes with a huge change in compliance costs. So you've got an installation that may well have been selling allowances and actually raising funds from the EU ETS to an installation that's facing quite significant compliance costs, and that is all due to that the carbon leakage list protection falling away. So there's some worked examples on how free allocation may be affected into phase 4, and we model these scenarios for all of our customers to ensure that they have a good handle on where their free allocation is going in phase 4. So I'll hand back to Simon now. That's the end of my section. So I'll hand back to you, Simon. Okay, I think I can hear we've got a couple of technical difficulties. So Simon, when you're ready, interrupt me. If not, start going through the key takeaways.
Okay, thanks, Tom. And
okay, there you go.
Yeah. Thank you to Tom and Lewis, and for that whistle-stop review of phase 4 and how the free allocation process is going to work. And I'm sure if you wonder where you are now, that the calculation of the free allocations for phase 4, for first part of phase 4 and the second part of phase 4, is complex and not possibly helped by the introduction of the Green Deal, which is due to come in and may change things again. So basically, as we've seen, many installations can expect low free allocations in phase 4 because they drop off the leakage list. They can't cherry pick the historical activity levels because they are now set, and the linear reduction factor is declining faster than in phase 3. The benchmarks will be set at the highest level of the assumed efficiencies for most sectors as well. So that's another thing. So as we say, some will get more free allocation thanks to the end of the cross-section correcting factor or the historical activity level changes. And allocations, as we see, are going to become more dynamic throughout phase 4. So as EU prices rise, the understanding of your free allocation is becoming more important, and especially the reduction in the free allocation for phase 4 and the environmental risk exposures set by the EU and the significant ambitions that the EU have for being a global leader on the environment. And the EU sees the EU ETS as the main tool for reducing emissions. So there's some of the key takeaways I think we've got from the presentations. As I said, it's complex, and I think anybody who wants more information can come direct to us, and we can help work with them, really. So how did we become involved? So we've been working with companies right across Europe for over 15 years. We have people in each country across Europe working in the individual countries, and we try to create a partnership with our clients, working with our carbon support program. Our carbon support program will give quarterly updates specific to an installation, and that will calculate, as we've shown in the presentation, calculate your potential free allocation right out for the whole of phase 4 to 2030. It will give price forecasts and updates, and we will help set achievable budgets out to 2030 as we see the prices move. We'll also work with you on setting strategies for hedging to remove some of the risk and to give you some guarantee of price. And also, as we've seen, regulations change regularly, change all the time. So we would keep you updated on the regulation change and how that would affect your installation. So moving on from that, if anybody has any questions, as I said, please put them on the chat. We have got a couple of questions come in, which we'll go through. And one we've got coming from Sophia, which is quite an interesting one, and a one that we're asked a lot. As the phase 4 free allocation is reducing, as we've seen, phase 4 allocation is going to reduce, and potentially carbon prices are going to increase, can you use phase 3 allowances in phase 4? Tom, I mean, do you have any comment on the use of phase 3 allowances in phase 4?
Yeah, sure. So we would call that that banking. So using or taking phase 3 allowances forward into phase 4. The good news is that banking can be done in unlimited amounts. So either allowances you have received for free or allowances that you may have purchased in the market can be stored in your registry account, carried forward into phase 4 and used against compliance requirements in any year you require. So banking is unlimited and certainly can be done. One word of note for anyone that may have been borrowing, and borrowing we would say that i.e. you're using your 2021 free allocation against 2020 emissions, that will not be possible. So you can't forward borrow from phase 4 to use against phase 3, but you certainly can carry phase 3 allowances forward into phase 4 for compliance.
Okay, thanks, Tom. And just one bit of clarity, a phase 3 allowance into phase 4 is a 1-for-1 swap.
Yeah, so they will essentially you won't notice any difference anyway. It will be an EUA as marked in your registry, a general allowance.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that. Lewis, I've got one here for you, which is coming from Thomas. Do we know any details on the modernisation fund and when does it open?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and I don't have detail available right now that we can share with the audience. But what I'd like to do is take that question away and answer that more fully directly. And if anyone else is interested in that subject area, then please get in touch, and we'll add you to the answer for that particular question.
Okay, thank you. Another one from Alessandro. Any idea when the historical activity levels for phase 4 will be defined? Shouldn't it be on Q3? Tom, is that something we can answer, or do we take away?
Yeah, I've just seen the question as well in the Q&A, and I think Alessandro corrected himself slightly, and I think he actually meant the benchmark. So in terms of the benchmarks for phase 4, they will be finalised at some point at the back end of this year or into Q1 next year. There is no exact timeline for them being finalised. In terms of the second half of the question, shouldn't it be on Q3? I'm not sure exactly what the question is asking there. If it's in terms of when they'll be released, as I say, it'll be Q4 or Q1 next year. In terms of the data it's looking at data from several years ago. So it's the issue with updating things like the benchmark rates is that it's an absolutely huge task for the Commission to collect all the data, to do the analysis, and to then ensure that it's up to date. So whilst ideally you would have perhaps regular updates on things like benchmarks, in practice it's actually very difficult to achieve just due to the size and the complexity of the EU ETS and the data that is required to make that analysis.
Yeah, I think we covered this question actually at the Carbon Fast Forward one-day conference back in June, and we had a representative from the German Emissions Authority. We posed the question: shouldn't installations be entitled to understand their free allocation right now in order to make plans for the future? And the response wasn't particularly helpful in that we were told to expect free allocation actually taking place possibly as late as Q2 2021, as they churn through all the data they need to come up with. But there are indications out there of where the Commission expects each industry sector to fall into, and that's allowed us to make the calculations that we've done for the graphs that we've shown you. So there is some information out there, but not definitive at this stage.
Okay, thanks for that. Just another quick question I've got here, and the Green Deal. So there's all the talk about the Green Deal now coming out of the EU, and how do we see this influencing the free allocation going forward? Is there a threat that free allocation could almost disappear in phase 4 under an aggressive Green Deal? Tom, have you got anything on that?
Yeah, sure. So I think obviously the details of the Green Deal are still being decided. So we don't expect any material kind of updates on that until the middle of next year, when the Commission will put forward their kind of grand proposal on how this will all tie together. Every piece of environmental legislation is being looked at across Europe. I think with the Green Deal, as I said in the presentation, the European Commission have been very clear that they want to be the global leader in the fight against climate change. That undoubtedly will involve higher costs. In terms of free allocation, obviously the free allocation is there to protect Europe's industry and ensure this smooth transition, and I don't think that changes because of the Green Deal. But the details within the Green Deal will decide effectively what changes with regards to free allocation. And I can't see people getting more free allocation under the Green Deal. It's going to be less. The sectors that are covered by a carbon border mechanism are likely to lose all free allocation, so they will be the biggest change. The risk for everyone else, I think, is that there's that the emissions reduction targets are so aggressive that obviously there's just less and less allowances to go round every single year as we go forward, and therefore things like the cross-sectoral correction factor will come into play because there just simply won't be enough allowances to go round for all the free allocation calculations.
Okay, thanks, Tom. That's great. Thanks for that answer. Okay, it seems appropriate now. We'll just do a quick poll, if that's okay, with regards to the Green Deal. So if we put the poll up on your screen, and if you can just have a quick read and answer the questions, it will give us a bit of good information, really. Thank you. Okay, how are we doing on the poll? Okay, thanks for that, everybody. Yeah, I think seems to be some positive responses from the Green Deal, and I think it looks like it's getting a positive response in that it is possibly the right way to decarbonize Europe and increase environmental opportunities. So, Tom, I think you've got some more questions on the chat. Do you want to have a look at answer some of those questions, or
Sure.
take them offline?
Sure. Yeah, I think we've got time for one or two more. One of the questions that's come in is in terms of I think this is the gist of the question. So it's in terms of how much free allocation an installation will receive relative to emissions if they fall off the carbon leakage list. So those that fall off the carbon leakage list are going to see the biggest change in free allocation in phase 4. Anyone who falls off the carbon leakage list by the end of phase 4 will be getting 0 free allocation unless they're district heating. In terms of how much free allocation they will get relative to the emissions, it's impossible to answer because it's installation specific. So it will depend on where you sit in that benchmark kind of scale within the sector. So if you're very efficient within that sector, then your percentage of free allocation compared to emissions is likely to be higher. If you're very inefficient within that sector, then obviously your percentage is going to be lower. So what we do know is that it will be that free allocation will be a maximum of 30% of your benchmark calculation. So it will be a very large change for a company that falls off the carbon leakage list. In terms of other questions, we do have one around CER certificates in 2021. So CERs will still be able to be bought in 2021 to settle the final year of phase 3. So you have up to the end of April to get those done. That will hopefully help installations carry some extra allowances forward into phase 4 to kind of soften the reduction in free allocation for many. Another question, perhaps I can direct this one at Lewis. So what are the chances of the CSCF being triggered in the second subphase, so the free allocation period 2 in phase 4?
No, that's a great question. And so the way the things work at the moment is that if there's a chance that the CSCF will be triggered in the first half of phase 4, that some of the EUAs that were due to be auctioned will be clawed back from the auction pool and added to the free allocation pool, and the expectation is that the free allocation won't be affected by the cross-sectoral correction factor, and everyone will get their HAL times benchmark times carbon leakage exposure factor. Now, when we get into the second half of phase 4, there are a number of factors that come into play, of course. So the first is that the linear reduction factor is reducing the number of allowances available all the time, and that happens every year. And we also have the prospect of the Green Deal increasing that linear reduction factor. Now, the current target for the EU is a 40% reduction by 2030. The expectation is a minimum 50% reduction by 2030 from the Green Deal, and potentially 55%. Of course, all of that will impact the EUAs that are available, and the only way, therefore, that the cross-sectoral correction factor won't get triggered is if emissions from industry decline a large amount, which seems unlikely, or if more EUAs are pulled from the auction pool, which is possible. So, answering your question, very difficult, but in the absence of extra allowances coming from the auction pool, I would anticipate that the CSCF would be triggered in the second half. The other factor that I've not mentioned actually is the carbon border adjustment mechanism that should be, if it's going to happen, will be enforced by then, which could have an even larger impact on companies' free allocation, which actually might provide extra allowances for the rest of industry that doesn't get that border adjustment protection. So quite a number of unknowns to make a definitive call on that, but on the face of it, it seems likely unless there are some major changes.
Okay, thanks, Lewis, and thanks, Lewis, and thanks, Tom. That's been very interesting, and I think, as it shows in our webinar, that a lot of changes are coming from phase 4 from January, and also for the UK installations, Brexit is not helping the situation, and where do we go, really? So that concludes it for this morning. It was a quick run through. It was technical, and I hope it gave you a bit more of an insight into how the market is working. Although we're in a relatively mature market, it's still a lot of changes happening. And if you do need more information, please come back to us. You know where we are. And just to say that we hold our annual, or we partner Carbon Pulse in their annual conference, should we say, Carbon Forward. And this year, of course, like all conferences, it will be online and from the 14th and 15th of October. And that will go into further details of phase 4 and looking at pricing as well, and where we expect prices to go for carbon. So, saying that, thanks for joining us. I hope you found it a useful hour this morning, and please don't hesitate to come back and ask any further questions. So thanks, Tom, and thanks, Lewis, for your contribution. And have a good day, everybody. Thank you. Goodbye.